This is a test. You don't have to say it out loud, but what's the first thing you think about when you hear the story of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes? I'll bet it was the Eucharist. All right. It's good if it wasn't the Eucharist that you first thought of, because that's not what it's about. Later on, years later, we began to use this episode as a symbol of the Eucharist. As a matter of fact, there's a Benedictine monastery on the shore of Galilee, the Sea of Galilee, and they have uncovered the floor of the original building, which dates back to 800. And the mosaic on the floor is a basket of bread and 2 fish. And it's right where the altar would have been in those days, as symbolizing the Eucharistic meal with the loaves and the fishes. But you always have to read these stories in the gospel in context. The apostles, or the disciples, had just gotten back from work that Jesus had given them to do, and they had been very successful, and they were all excited about it. And Jesus says to them, come aside and rest a while. Let's go on retreat. But this episode happens in between that. So this is an interruption. The disciples were not happy with this crowd of people. They weren't supposed to be there. They had come on their own, and they were interrupting the flow of the apostles and the disciples' experience of Jesus. And of course, we all know what that's like. Interruptions, things we want to do, and we get sidetracked. Now, what happens here is also very interesting. It doesn't say that Jesus fed the crowd. It says the disciples fed the crowd. Jesus said the blessing, grace before meals, and the language of it is very Eucharistic. But of course, that's what Luke said later. But he says, you feed them. And they say, how can we feed them? We've only got 5 loaves and 2 fish. Jesus says, you feed them. And what happened? Everybody got fed. And then they went on retreat. What does this have to say to us who are just like them, the disciples of this Jesus who we call Christ, the Messiah, the Lord? I think it reflects sometimes on what we think about and what we assume when we come to Mass. So often, and I'm giving you my experience over my lifetime, I've come to Mass to be fed, to enter into this close union with Jesus, this personal relationship with Jesus, to experience Jesus in the bread and the wine of the Eucharist. It becomes a very one-on-one. And yet the Eucharist is never presented in the Scriptures as a one-on-one with Jesus. It's always a communal meal. And if you read through the New Testament, and it'd be good to do that sometime, just keep a notebook. And every time you get Jesus at the dinner table, put a little mark. You're going to fill a page with little marks, because he spent most of his ministry sitting down at table, and usually with some very unlikely characters. I think he still does that today, and we are those characters. But his whole approach to the people, his whole revealing to them of this reign of God that he came to proclaim, was done at the table. And in those days, that was really serious business, because you only ate with certain people. Even the men and women of a family didn't eat together. That's how exclusive table fellowship was. Now, and to sit down with the people that Jesus sat down with was absolutely absurd in the mentality of that day. And yet he still continues to do that in the Eucharistic meal, which we are about to partake in. But I think the message, to me at least, from this episode with the 5,000 and their feeding is the fact that there were 12 baskets left over. What happened to those leftovers? We have no idea. Hopefully they weren't wasted. But the same is true today. When we go to the Lord's table, there are always leftovers. I don't mean the Eucharist that's put in the tabernacle to take to the sick or for adoration. I mean, what happens at a meal, and at the Eucharistic meal above all, is that those who partake of the table are strengthened, invigorated, given the power to go on in their Christian life, in their relationship with Christ, and with the rest of the people at the table. And we're only the tip of the iceberg, this small group here, when we talk about those who also come to the table. And the power that Jesus gives us through this meal is not stingy. It's abundant. Always reminds me of that ad for spaghetti in one of the television years ago. This big Italian mama gets up and says, abbondanza, abbondanza, loads of food. Well, that's the Eucharistic meal. We may have made it very stingy by the way we use our bread and wine, but it is Christ in his abundance who comes to us and fills us to overflowing, not only to live our Christian life individually, but to share it with others. He gives us more than we need individually. And so the big question for me for this reading is, what happens to the leftovers?